They were 36 and 8 years old. A mother and her daughter sleeping in the back seat of a 2003 Ford Focus behind a Walmart in Tacoma, Washington. The windows fogged with their breathing condensation running down the glass in slow, crooked lines that caught the parking lot lights and turned them into something almost beautiful. If you didn't think too hard about why two people were sleeping in a car in the first place. The dawn came gray and thin through those windows, the kind of Pacific Northwest light that never quite committed to being day, that hung somewhere between darkness and dawn, like it couldn't make up its mind. Wren woke first. She always woke first. 8 years old, with tangled auburn hair and a stuffed rabbit missing one ear pressed against her chest. The same rabbit she'd carried since she was 2, back when they still had an apartment with a bathtub and a kitchen that smelled like coffee in the mornings, and a door that locked from the inside. She sat up carefully, moving slowly the way she'd learned to do so. The car wouldn't rock and wake her mother. Marlo lay curled in the front seat, her jacket balled under her head, and her nursing shoes still on, because you never knew when you'd have to move fast, when security would knock on the window and tell them they couldn't sleep here, and shoes took too long to find in the dark. Wren pulled her notebook from the backpack wedged between the seats. The cover was bent and the spiral binding had lost 3 rings, but the pages inside were filled with drawings done in colored pencil. Careful and detailed. Always the same subject. Houses. Every single page was a house. Some had gardens with flowers she'd copied from a library book. Some had porches with rocking chairs. Some had dogs in the yard. Though she had never had a dog, had never even been allowed to have a dog in any of the apartments they had rented before the apartments ran out entirely. All of them had the same 3 stick figures standing in front of the door, holding hands, 2 tall and 1 small, though in real life there had only ever been 2 of them. The 3rd figure was someone Wren had invented, because every house she drew needed a family, and every family she drew needed to be complete. She opened to a fresh page and started sketching while the parking lot came to life around them. A delivery truck backing up with its warning beep cutting through the quiet. A woman in a blue vest walking fast toward the entrance, coffee in one hand, phone in the other. The world going about its business of being normal, while Wren drew a chimney with smoke curling out of it, because chimneys meant fireplaces and fireplaces meant warmth, and warmth meant home. Her stomach made a sound. She pressed her hand against it and kept drawing. Marlo's alarm went off at 6:15. The soft chime she'd chosen because anything harsh made Wren flinch. She sat up in the front seat with the disoriented look of someone who hadn't slept so much as passed out from exhaustion. Her scrubs were wrinkled, the pale blue ones from Tacoma General, where she had worked for 3 years before the staffing cuts took her position. No amount of begging or negotiating or offering to work double shifts could bring it back. She still wore them, because they were comfortable, because they reminded her she'd been someone with a job and a badge and a name printed on a lanyard. Someone who mattered in the small, specific way that people who take care of other people matter. They went through their routine. It had become a routine which was the saddest part. That sleeping in a car had developed its own rhythms and systems and small efficiencies. Marlowe heated water in a camping kettle plugged into the cigarette lighter. Wren held the baby wipes while Marlowe cleaned her face, then cleaned her own. Then they traded places so Wren could change into her school clothes in the back seat, while Marlowe held up a blanket for privacy. A granola bar split in half. Marlowe handed Wren the larger piece and kept the smaller one. She pretended she wasn't hungry when Wren looked at her with those dark eyes that noticed everything and said nothing. The school bus stop was 3 blocks east. Past the gas station where Marlowe bought coffee, so weak it was barely more than hot water. Past the laundromat where she washed their clothes every Sunday. Using quarters she saved in a jar under the driver's seat. Past the church that offered free meals on Tuesdays and Thursdays, but only if you sat through a sermon first, which Marlowe did. Not because she believed, but because believing wasn't the price of admission. And Wren needed to eat. They walked together in the cold. Wren's backpack hung low on her shoulders, the zipper on one side broken and held together with a safety pin Marlowe had found on the floor of the library. Inside were school books and a pencil case, and the notebook and a granola bar wrapper Wren had folded into a tiny perfect square. Because she had read somewhere that folding things small enough made them disappear. Mom. Wren's voice was careful, the way it got when she was about to say something she had been thinking about for a long time. Jessica asked if I could come to her house after school Friday. Marlowe's step faltered. Just barely. Just a half-second break in her stride. But Wren caught it, because Wren caught everything. I told her we're moving soon, that our house is all packed up in boxes. I said maybe after we get settled in the new place. The lie was so practiced, so smoothly delivered with such casual certainty that Marlowe felt something crack behind her ribs. Her 8-year-old daughter had learned to lie about having a home the way other children learn to tie their shoes, naturally, without thinking. A basic life skill acquired through repetition. That smart baby. That was a good answer. Wren nodded. She didn't smile. At the bus stop, 4 other children waited with their parents. Backpacks that matched. Lunches in proper containers. Jackets that fit and weren't bought at Goodwill 3 sizes too big so they'd last longer. Marlowe watched them and felt the distance between her daughter and those children like a physical gap. Measurable. Growing wider every month. Wren hugged her. Small arms tight around Marlowe's waist face pressed into her side. Holding on for exactly 3 seconds before letting go and joining the line for the bus. She didn't look back. She'd stopped looking back months ago, as if turning around might reveal something she wasn't ready to see. Marlowe watched the bus pull away, then walked back to the Ford and sat in the driver's seat and gave herself 4 minutes to cry. Not 5. She'd learned that 5 was too many. That 5 minutes of crying turned into 10. And 10 turned into an afternoon of paralysis she couldn't afford. 4 minutes. Then she wiped her face with the sleeve of her scrubs and drove to St. Anne's Women's Shelter on the east side. The same shelter where she'd shown up 10 years ago with infant Wren in her arms. running from a husband whose temper turned to fists when he drank. And he drank every single day. Sister Margaret still ran the intake desk, 73 years old, built like a fence post with reading glasses perpetually pushed up on her forehead and a voice that managed to be gentle and immovable at the same time. She'd offered Marlowe a bed 10 years ago and never forgotten her, never treated her like a case number, never made her feel like charity. Marlowe used the shelter's mailing address because a post office box cost money, and no employer wanted to send interview confirmations to a Walmart parking lot. She checked in twice a week, filled out job applications on the shelter's ancient desktop computer, and pretended she wasn't watching the other women cycle through the same doors she'd walked through a decade ago. Some of them had been here then. Some of them would be here a decade from now. The rotation of desperation that kept turning and turning and turning. Sister Margaret looked up when Marlowe came through the door, and there was something in her expression, a brightness behind the usual steadiness that made Marlowe stop. "There's a letter for you. Came yesterday afternoon. Looks official." The envelope was heavy, cream-colored paper stock that felt expensive. The kind you bought when you wanted someone to know, or the contents mattered before they even opened it. The return address read, Hayes and Associates Attorneys at Law, Eureka Springs, Arkansas. Marlowe's first thought was debt. Someone had found her. Some creditor from the apartment she'd been evicted from. Some bill she'd forgotten or couldn't pay. And now it was catching up to her in the form of legal stationery. She opened it, standing right there in the lobby. Sister Margaret pretending to organize intake forms, but clearly watching from the corner of her eye. The letter was typed on matching stationery. Formal. Precise. "Dear Miss Beckett, we are writing to inform you that you have been named as the sole beneficiary in the estate of Silas James Beckett, your late great-uncle. Mr. Beckett passed away 12 months ago at the age of 87. His estate includes a log cabin structure on 38 acres of forested land in Carroll County, Arkansas, in the Ozark Mountain region. There are no outstanding debts, liens, or encumbrances. Property taxes have been prepaid through a trust for the next 40 years. Mr. Beckett also designated a travel fund to cover your expenses should you wish to inspect the property. Please contact our office at your earliest convenience." Enclosed was a check for $1,200, made out to Marlowe Beckett. Marlowe read the letter twice, then a third time. The words stayed the same but refused to make sense, like a sentence in a language she almost spoke but not quite. Silas Beckett. She turned the name over in her mind, searching through the scattered memories of family gatherings she tried hard to forget. Her father's uncle. She'd met him once, maybe twice, at her father's funeral 18 months ago, standing in the back of the church in a worn corduroy jacket, not speaking to anyone, leaving before the reception, a tall, quiet man who smelled like pine and didn't make small talk. She held the check up to the light, as if it might be counterfeit, as if 1,200 real dollars addressed to her real name was the kind of thing that needed verification. Sister Margaret came around the desk, her hand resting lightly on Marlowe's arm, steady and warm. Marlo, is everything all right? My great uncle died. He left me a cabin in Arkansas, 38 acres. Marlo's voice sounded strange to her own ears, flat and uncertain, like she was reporting someone else's news. I barely remember him. Sister Margaret read the letter over Marlo's shoulder. This is a door opening, Marlo. Don't be afraid to walk through it. Marlo wanted to believe that, wanted to let the possibility in. But she'd learned that hope was a luxury with a cost, that believing things would get better made it worse when they didn't. And they usually didn't. The cabin could be nothing. A pile of rotting logs in the woods with a collapsed roof and snakes in the walls. Or it could be something. The check felt real in her fingers. $1,200, more money than she'd held at one time in 2 years. She called the number on the letterhead from Sister Margaret's office phone, her hand shaking just enough that she misdialed the first time. The attorney, Calvin Hayes, had a voice like gravel, smoothed by water. Old and rough, but somehow reassuring. He told her Silas had been very specific. The cabin and everything in it went to Marlo Beckett and her daughter. No one else. The deed was ready to transfer. All she had to do was come sign. No mortgage, no taxes for 40 years. Free and clear. Marlo hung up and stared at the wall above Sister Margaret's desk, where a wooden cross hung next to a calendar from 2 years ago that nobody had bothered to replace. I think we're going to Arkansas. She should not have called Victoria. She knew this even as she dialed. Knew it the way you know not to touch a hot stove, but do it anyway. Because some part of you still believes this time will be different. This time the stove won't burn. This time family will act like family. Victoria answered on the 4th ring. Marlo could hear the click of heels on hardwood, the ambient hum of an open house or a showing. The life her older sister had built on confidence and control, and the absolute certainty that she was the most capable person in any room. Marlo, I'm between clients. What is it? Marlo told her about the letter, the cabin, the inheritance. Tried to keep her voice neutral. Tried not to sound like she was asking for anything. Because she wasn't. She was sharing news. The way sisters were supposed to share news. With the assumption that the other person would be happy for you. The silence lasted long enough that Marlo checked the phone to make sure the call was still connected. Then Victoria's voice came back, sharp as a closing door. A cabin in the Ozarks. Marlo, be serious. You can't manage a checking account. You're going to manage property. Just sign it over to me. I'll handle the sale and we'll split whatever it brings, which won't be much. He left it to me, Victoria. To me and Wren. Specifically, Marlo heard Garrett's voice in the background, muffled like Victoria had her hand over the phone, then clearer as she switched to speaker. Is that Marlo? What does she want this time? Dad's uncle Silas died. Left her some shack in Arkansas. She thinks she's gonna keep it. Garrett's laugh was a short, ugly sound. Sure she does. And what's she gonna do with it? Park her car inside. The words landed exactly where they were aimed. Marlowe's hand tightened on the phone, but her voice stayed level. I didn't call to ask permission. I called because I thought you should know. How generous of you. Nora's voice now, quieter than the other two but present, listening. Marlowe waited for Nora to say something else, to take a side, to be the sister who'd once driven Marlowe to the emergency room when Wren had a fever of 104 and her car wouldn't start. But Nora said nothing more, and her silence was its own kind of answer. Victoria spoke again. Sign it over, Marlowe. You're not equipped for this. After everything we've done for you, the least you could do is let someone competent handle it. Everything you've done for me. Marlowe heard her own voice go thin and tight. You took Dad's insurance money. All three of you. You said you'd pay me back, and then you blocked my number. Those were loans. Garrett cut in. Not our fault you can't hold on to $1. I used my share to pay for his funeral, because none of you offered. And then I gave you what was left, because you said you needed it. And I believed you, because I thought that's what family did. A voice cut through from somewhere behind Marlowe. High and clear and shaken with something that wasn't fear. You're mean. All of you are mean. Marlowe spun around. Wren stood in the doorway of Sister Margaret's office. Backpack on one shoulder, school shoes muddy from the walk. Wednesday. Early release. Marlowe had forgotten. Wren was supposed to meet her at the library at 1, but she must have walked to the shelter instead. Must have heard the voices coming through the phone and stopped to listen. You took Grandpa's money. Wren's voice shook but held. You promised to pay Mom back, and you didn't. And now you want to take our cabin too. The silence on the other end of the line had a texture to it, something brittle and dangerous. Well, Victoria's voice went syrup-sweet and twice as toxic. Sounds like someone raised a little eavesdropper. Control your daughter, Marlowe, and sign the papers before you embarrass yourself any further. Marlowe hung up. Her hand was shaking, but it was a different kind of shaking now. Not fear, but anger. Clean and hot and clarifying. Wren stood 3 feet away. Tears on her cheeks, but her chin up. Her jaw set in a way that made her look exactly like William Beckett in the photograph Marlowe kept in the glove compartment. The same stubborn refusal to yield. The same quiet fury at injustice. Marlowe knelt down on the linoleum floor of Sister Margaret's office and took her daughter's face in both hands. That cabin is ours. Uncle Silas wanted us to have it. We are going to drive to Arkansas and walk through that door and make it our home. Even if it's falling apart, even if it's falling apart. Wren wiped her nose with the back of her hand. We can fix things. You're good at fixing things. Marlowe pulled her in close. This fierce small girl who'd never had a real bedroom. Who lied about where she lived to protect her mother's dignity. Who just told off 3 adults without flinching. Yeah, baby. We can fix things. That night in the Ford after the parking lot went dark and the last employees drove away and the security lights cast their orange pools across the asphalt, Wren couldn't sleep. She lay in the back seat with the blanket pulled to her chin and her notebook open on her chest, staring at the ceiling, trying to imagine what Arkansas looked like. She'd checked out a book from the library about the Ozarks. The pictures showed green mountains rolling into valleys, rivers cutting through limestone bluffs, forests so thick the light came through in columns like the windows of a church. She turned to a fresh page and drew a new house. This one was different from the others. It had logs instead of bricks, a metal roof, a porch with a railing, trees on both sides pressing in close like they were trying to hug it. Two figures stood in front of the door, one tall and one small, holding hands. She left space for the third figure, but didn't draw it. Not yet. She wasn't sure yet who it would be. They left Tacoma at sunrise. Everything they owned fit in the car with room to spare, which was its own kind of heartbreak if you thought about it too long. So Marlowe didn't think about it. Clothes in garbage bags, Wren's school supplies in a cardboard box, Marlowe's nursing textbooks stacked on the floor of the back seat. The ones she'd refused to sell no matter how bad things got, because selling them meant admitting she'd never work again. And she wasn't ready to admit that. A framed photograph of William Beckett holding infant Wren at her christening. His face so full of love it hurt to look at. The last thing Marlowe packed was the letter from Calvin Hayes, folded into the glove compartment where she could touch it if she needed proof that this was real. That somewhere in Arkansas a door was waiting to open. Wren sat in the back seat with her notebook and a gas station map spread across her knees. She'd appointed herself navigator, calculating distances and marking their progress with a pencil that was wearing down to a stub. At the top of a fresh page, she'd written in her careful printing the journey to our new home. And below that she'd drawn the ford with mountains in the distance and two faces visible through the windshield, both of them smiling. They drove east. The landscape changed slowly, the way landscapes do when you're driving through a country as wide as grief. Seattle's gray suburbs giving way to farmland, farmland giving way to the dry brown hills of eastern Washington, then Idaho's pine forests, then Montana's impossible sky. Mom, do you think there are bears in Arkansas? Probably. Black bears, mostly. They generally leave people alone. What about mountain lions, maybe? But they're shy. You'd be lucky to ever see one. Wren's eyes went wide, not scared, delighted. We're going to live somewhere with actual wild animals, like not pigeons. Marlowe caught Wren's reflection in the rearview mirror and saw something she hadn't seen in months. Excitement. Genuine, uncomplicated excitement. The kind children were supposed to feel about new places and adventures. The kind that homelessness had slowly squeezed out of her daughter, like water from a wrung cloth. They crossed Idaho and the corner of Montana and into Wyoming, stopping for gas and bathroom breaks and peanut butter sandwiches Marlowe made on the hood of the car, using a loaf of bread and a jar she'd bought at the last town's dollar store. Wren reported their progress every hour, her finger tracing the route on the map with the seriousness of a cartographer. 312 miles today. Tomorrow we need to do about 400 to make it to northern Arkansas by nightfall. They slept at a rest stop in Wyoming. Semis idling nearby. Stars overhead so bright and numerous that Wren pressed her face to the window and whispered something Marlowe couldn't hear. In the morning they drove through Colorado and into Kansas, and then south. The land flattening out and then rising again as they crossed into Arkansas, and the Ozarks appeared on the horizon like a promise. The mountains were different from what Marlowe had expected. Not sharp and dramatic like the Rockies, but rounded and ancient, covered in oak and hickory and dogwood, creased with hollows and ravines where creeks ran clear over stone. The towns they passed through were small in a way that felt deliberate rather than diminished. Clapboard storefronts and churches with white steeples and pickup trucks angled into parking spots outside diners where the menus hadn't changed in 40 years. Calvin Hayes's office sat on a side street in Eureka Springs, a town built into the side of a hill so steeply that some buildings had their front door on one street and their back door on the street above. Stone walls and Victorian storefronts and winding roads that didn't believe in straight lines. Hayes was waiting for them. 68 years old, silver-haired with the weathered face of a man who spent his weekends fishing rather than billing hours. He shook Marlowe's hand with a grip that meant business, then knelt down to Wren's level and offered his hand to her too. Palm up, letting her decide. You must be Wren. Your uncle talked about you. He didn't know me, no, but he knew about you. He kept track in his way. They signed papers in Hayes's small office. Diplomas on the wall, leather chairs cracked with age. A window looking out at the Ozark Hills going gold in the late afternoon light. Marlowe's signature came out shaky and uncertain, and she hated that. Hated the way her hand betrayed her nerves when the rest of her was trying so hard to be steady. Hayes told them about Silas while Marlowe signed. Military veteran. Served in the Army from 1958 to 62. Came home and couldn't settle. Worked as an accountant in Seattle for 6 years. Saved every paycheck. Then bought 38 acres of Ozark forest and disappeared. Built the cabin over 2 summers. Living in a tent while he worked. Never married. Never had children. Just him in the woods in the quiet for 35 years. Why us? Wren's question was the same one circling Marlowe's mind. Hayes looked at the girl, then at Marlowe, and something softened in his expression. He told me once that your mother was the only person in the family who gave without counting. He said your grandpa William was the same way, and that the two of you were the only ones worth trusting. He planned this for a long time, Marlowe. This wasn't an afterthought. He chose you. Hayes drove them out in his pickup, a battered Silverado that handled the Forest Service roads with the confidence of long practice. Pavement turned to gravel. Gravel turned to dirt. Dirt turned to 2 ruts through the woods, barely wide enough for the truck. The forest closed in on both sides, oak and hickory and cedar. Late afternoon light falling through the canopy in gold bars that moved across the windshield like something alive. Then the trees opened up, and there it was. 2 stories of hand-hewn logs darkened to the color of honey by decades of weather. A metal roof gone green with patina, but still straight and sound. A stone chimney rising from the center. A wide porch wrapping the front. The railing carved with patterns of leaves and birds. Each one different. Each one precise. And behind it all, the Ozark ridges rose blue and quiet against the sky turning pink at the edges. Wren made a sound, a small, sharp intake of breath, involuntary and pure. She had the truck door open before Hayes had fully stopped, her feet hitting the ground at a run, crossing the clearing toward the cabin with her backpack bouncing against her shoulders, and her arms pumping and her voice rising up into the trees in a wordless shout of joy that sent birds scattering from the branches. Marlowe got out more slowly. Her legs felt strange beneath her, unsteady, as if the ground wasn't quite real, as if she might wake up any second in the back of the Ford with the parking lot lights bleeding through the windows. But the dirt was solid under her feet. The air smelled like cedar and fallen leaves, and something mineral and clean that she had never smelled before. Something that had no name but might have been called distance from everything that had hurt her. Hayes put the brass key in her hand, old and heavy, worn smooth by 35 years of Silas's fingers. Take your time. There's food inside, firewood stacked by the stove. I'll come back in a few days. See how you're settling in. Wren was already at the front door, bouncing on her toes, reaching for the key before Marlowe had crossed the porch. She took it with both hands and fitted it into the lock with the careful reverence of someone performing a ceremony she didn't quite understand, but knew mattered. The lock turned. The door swung open. Warm air rolled out, carrying the smell of wood smoke and pine resin and dust that had been undisturbed for months. The accumulated quiet of a man who'd lived alone for 35 years and left his silence behind like a gift. Wren stepped over the threshold first, Marlowe right behind her. And in the stillness of that cabin in the last light of an October afternoon in the Ozark Mountains, Marlowe heard her daughter whisper 2 words that contained everything they had survived, and everything they'd hoped for, and everything they'd been afraid to believe was possible. We're home. The cabin revealed itself over the following days, the way a careful person reveals a secret, slowly and one layer at a time. Wren explored every corner with the methodical curiosity of a child who'd spent 2 years confined to a car's back seat and suddenly had rooms to move through, stairs to climb, a world small enough to comprehend, but large enough to feel like freedom. She found Silas's workshop in the back, tools hung on pegboard with their outlines traced in marker, so you knew exactly where each one belonged. She found the root cellar, cool and dim. Shelves lined with mason jars of preserves Silas had put up himself, labels in neat block printing. She found a trail through the woods that led to a creek running over limestone, water so clear she could count the pebbles on the bottom. Marlowe stood at the kitchen window one morning watching Wren run between the trees and felt something she hadn't felt in so long she'd almost forgotten the word for it. Safe. Not happy yet. Not ready for happy. But safe. Which was the ground that happy needed to grow from. She let herself stand there, with the wood stove crackling behind her and coffee percolating in Silas's old enamel pot, and let the feeling settle into her bones. The wood stove defeated her on the third morning. She packed the firebox too tight, starved the flame of oxygen, and filled the main room with smoke so thick Wren had to open every window while Marlowe stood on the porch coughing and furious with herself for failing at something Silas had apparently done without thinking for 35 years. A truck pulled up the forest road that afternoon. Not Hayes's Silverado, but a smaller pickup, rust around the wheel wells. Driven by a woman in her 70s wearing a canvas jacket and reading glasses, pushed up into gray hair that hadn't seen a salon in some time. Martha Kincaid. Dot. I run the general store down in Harmony. She climbed out with a cardboard box balanced on one hip. Heard Silas's people finally showed up. Brought you something. The box contained eggs, butter, a jar of blackberry preserves, a loaf of bread that was clearly homemade, and a handwritten note that read, "Welcome to the neighborhood." Below that, Silas was good people. His family is our family now. Marlowe didn't know what to say. Stood on the porch holding eggs she hadn't paid for, given by a stranger who expected nothing in return, and felt something loosen in her chest that had been wound tight for 2 years. Martha looked at the smoke still drifting from the open windows and assessed the situation with one glance. Packed the firebox too full. Marlowe nodded, embarrassed. Everybody does the first time. Split your kindling thinner and leave space between the logs. Fire needs to breathe. Same as people. Martha climbed back into her truck. I'll come by Thursday. You need anything from town, make a list. She drove away without waiting for thanks. As if feeding strangers and teaching them to build fires was simply what you did when you lived in the Ozarks, and someone new moved in up the mountain. The fire instruction helped. By the end of the first week, Marlowe could get the stove going on the first match, could keep it burning through the night by banking the coals the way Martha had described in a follow-up visit. That included a tutorial on the hand pump and a jar of soup that tasted like it had been simmering since the previous century. Wren enrolled in the elementary school in Harmony, a brick building with 62 students spanning kindergarten through 8th grade. The principal shook Marlowe's hand and told her that any kin of Silas Beckett was welcome. That Wren's records from Tacoma showed a child who'd maintained straight A's, despite circumstances that would have broken most adults. The school bus came up the forest road every morning at 7:45. Wren waited for it on the porch with her backpack and her notebook, drawing while she waited. And on the third morning, she came back inside to show Marlowe what she'd made. The cabin rendered in colored pencil with startling accuracy. The log walls, the green roof, the stone chimney, the porch where she was sitting. Behind it, the ridgeline she could see from the yard, blue-gray in the morning haze. Two figures on the porch, one tall and one small, not holding hands this time, but sitting side by side, looking out at the view. Underneath, she had written in her careful printing, "Our real house." Marlowe pinned it to the kitchen wall above the stove and looked at it every morning while the coffee percolated. Let it remind her that this was actually happening, that the cabin was real and the deed was in her name, and 38 acres of Ozark forest stretched out around them like a promise that hadn't been broken yet. It was Wren who found it. Of course it was Wren, with her notebook and her tape measure and her need to map every space she inhabited, to measure and document and make sure the walls were where they were supposed to be, as if measurement could prevent a home from disappearing. She came up the stairs on the 5th day with her notebook open to a page of numbers, her brow pulled tight in concentration. "Mom, the outside wall is 42 feet, but all the rooms inside only add up to 37. There's 5 feet missing." They searched together, Marlowe walking the perimeter, counting steps, Wren running her hands along the interior walls, looking for seams, gaps, anything that didn't match. Everything appeared solid. Hand-hewn logs fitted tight, chinked with mortar that had held for decades. The stone fireplace dominated the north wall, river rock mortared with precision. The mantel carved with birds, dozens of species rendered in such detail you could almost hear them singing. But one bird low on the right side of the mantel caught Wren's attention. A small wren, the same bird as her name. The carving was deeper than the others, the wood around it worn, as if someone had pressed it over and over again for years. Wren pushed it, felt it give inward with a click that was soft but unmistakable. And then a sound came from behind the fireplace, stone against stone, grinding and ancient and deliberate. And a section of the floor in front of the hearth separated along a hairline crack that became visible only as 30 years of settled dust broke free and drifted up into the afternoon light. The panel was 4 feet square, perfectly fitted. It lifted on a counterweight mechanism when Marlowe found the edge and pulled, rising smooth and heavy on hinges that Silas had oiled so faithfully they still moved without resistance. Stone steps led down into darkness, narrow and steep, carved into the bedrock. Marlowe found a flashlight in the workshop, tested it, stood at the top of those stairs with Wren pressed against her hip, and the beam cutting down into whatever Silas James Beckett had spent 35 years building beneath his cabin in the Ozark Mountains. Wren looked up at her mother. Her eyes were wide but not frightened. In them, Marlowe saw the same expression Wren wore when she drew houses in her notebook, that fierce, quiet belief that something good was waiting if you were brave enough to walk toward it. Marlowe took her daughter's hand. Together they went down. The stairs were steeper than they looked. 12 steps carved into bedrock, each one worn smooth at the center from decades of Silas's boots going up and down. The flashlight beam swung wild as Marlowe steadied herself against the wall with her free hand. Wren gripped the back of her shirt, and followed close enough that Marlowe could feel her daughter's breath on her arm. The air changed as they descended, cooler by 10 degrees at least, dry and still, carrying a faint mineral smell like river stone after rain. The walls shifted from log to raw limestone, and Marlowe realized they were below the cabin's foundation now, below the frost line, in a chamber that Silas had carved or found or expanded from some natural cavity in the Ozark bedrock and turned into something that made her stop at the bottom step and hold the flashlight steady because her hands had started shaking. The ceiling vaulted upward, supported by hand-hewn beams that must have taken months to shape and set. Shelves lined every wall, floor to ceiling, organized with the same meticulous precision as the workshop above. Wooden crates stacked 3 high, each labeled with numbers and dates in block printing Marlowe recognized from the preserve jars in the root cellar. Glass-fronted cabinets, leather-bound ledgers arranged by size, a massive oak desk in the center with papers in neat stacks, and a journal lying open as if Silas had stepped out to make coffee and would be right back. Wren let go of Marlowe's shirt and moved toward the desk. She picked up the journal with both hands, supporting the spine the way the school librarian had taught her, and brought it to her mother. The title page read, "Private Collection and Estate Records. Property of Silas James Beckett. Begun March 4th, 1972. Updated through April 14th, 2023. Below that in different ink, slightly shakier handwriting as if added years later by an older hand, for Marlowe and Wren. Should you find this, everything here is yours. I trust you will know what to do. Marlowe set the flashlight on the desk and turned pages, entry after entry, each listing an item, the purchase date, the price paid, authentication details, and a current estimated value updated periodically in the margins. A landscape painting, oil on canvas, purchased at an estate sale in Fayetteville for $200 in 1974. Attributed to a minor Hudson River school painter. Appraised in 2019 at $68,000. A first edition of Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, 1885. Bought from a used bookshop in Little Rock for $40 in 1978. Now valued at $120,000. Stock certificates from companies that had been gambles when Silas bought them and had become household names since. Small gold bars purchased quarterly from a dealer in Tulsa. Each transaction recorded with the same care he'd applied to everything else. The discipline of an accountant who understood that patience and consistency could turn modest savings into something extraordinary. Wren had found a pry bar leaning against the desk and was working the lid off the nearest crate. Newspaper from 1981 protected a painting underneath. Oil on canvas. Mountains at dawn rendered in strokes that made the light look like it was actually moving. The signature in the lower corner matched the journal entry. Marlowe lifted it carefully and leaned it against the desk and stood looking at it for a long time. This painting that a quiet man had bought for $350 43 years ago and had kept in the dark ever since, waiting for the right people to find it. They opened crates for hours, lost track of time entirely, the vault having no windows and no sense of day or night. Just the flashlight, and then 2 oil lamps Marlowe found on a shelf near the stairs. Their wicks trimmed and ready as if Silas had prepared them, knowing someone would need light down here eventually. A bronze sculpture of a running horse, patina gone green, heavy enough that Marlowe needed both arms to lift it. Coins in velvet-lined cases, each one labeled. First edition books in archival sleeves. A framed survey map of Carroll County from 1847. Hand-colored, showing boundaries and waterways and property lines that hadn't existed in over a century. The final page of the main journal stopped Marlowe's breathing. Final accounting as of this date, April 2023. Total estimated value, based on current market conditions and professional appraisals, paintings and sculptures, 2,100,000. Rare books and manuscripts, 680,000. Gold and precious metals, 3,400,000. Stocks, bonds, and reinvested dividends, 2,520,000. Total estimated value, $8,700,000. Marlowe read it 3 times. The number refused to become ordinary, refused to shrink to a size she could hold in her mind. 8.7 million. Built over 35 years by a man who lived alone in the woods, who heated his cabin with a wood stove and pumped his water by hand, and apparently spent his solitude acquiring beautiful and valuable things with the same quiet precision he applied to splitting firewood. A separate envelope was tucked into the journal's back cover. Marlowe's name in Silas's handwriting. She opened it with fingers that trembled so badly she tore one corner. Dear Marlowe, I watched you from a distance for many years. I saw you at your father's funeral carrying your daughter on your hip while your siblings argued about the insurance money before William was even in the ground. I saw how you gave them what they asked for because you believed that was what family meant. I saw how they took and took. I saw what it cost you. This collection is my life's work. 35 years of patience and attention. I leave it to you because you understand something your siblings never learned. That giving without keeping score is not weakness. It is the rarest kind of strength. They will come for this. Stand firm. You have earned it not by blood, but by being the kind of person who deserves to be trusted. Give Wren the life she has earned by being brave enough to love you through all of it. With respect, Silas. Wren found the second letter in a small cedar box behind the desk. Addressed to the brave girl who finds my secret room. She brought it to Marlowe, who read it aloud. Her voice broke twice, and she had to stop and breathe before continuing. Dear Wren, if you are reading this, you found my hidden room. You must be clever and curious, and those are fine qualities. I never had children of my own, but I watched your mother raise you. And I knew she was doing it right, because you were still kind after everything the world did to make you hard. Whatever happens with what is in this room, remember that your mother gave up everything to keep you safe. Protect her now. She spent her whole life protecting you. Be brave, little one. The world needs brave children. Your friend across time, Silas. Wren pressed against Marlowe's side and didn't say anything for a long time. When she finally spoke, her voice was small and wondering. He wrote to me before he even met me. Marlowe pulled her daughter in close and let herself cry. Not the controlled 4-minute crying she rationed in the Ford. Something deeper and more complicated. Grief for a man she had barely known who had seen her more clearly than anyone alive. Relief so overwhelming it felt like pain. And underneath it all, a terrible gratitude that hurt, because it proved how starved she'd been for someone to notice, to care, to say you deserve better, and mean it. They climbed back up as the oil lamps flickered low, closed the panel carefully, sat together on the porch in the dark. Moths bumping against the window glass, the Ozarks making their nighttime sounds around them. Frogs and crickets and one owl calling from the ridge above the cabin in a voice that sounded like a question being asked over and over without expectation of an answer. Marlowe called Calvin Hayes the next morning, told him what they'd found. The silence on his end lasted a full 10 seconds before he spoke. And when he did, his voice carried something that might have been awe, or might have been the particular satisfaction of a man whose oldest client had managed one final surprise. He told me once there was more to the cabin than met the eye. I thought he meant the view. The fragile quiet lasted 11 days. Marlowe had been careful. Told no one except Hayes. Kept the vault sealed. Went about the work of settling into the cabin, as if the most remarkable thing about it was the plumbing, which, in fairness, was remarkable in its own right. The hand pump requiring a technique Marlowe's arms hadn't learned yet. Her nursing muscles apparently calibrated for different kinds of labor. Martha came by on Thursday with groceries and more fire lessons, and a story about Silas fixing her roof in '97 after an ice storm. How he'd shown up with a ladder and a bucket of tar and spent 2 days up there in the cold. Didn't ask. Didn't bill her. Just did it because that's what neighbors did. That's how it works out here, Martha said. You take care of the place. The place takes care of you. Marlowe tried to thank her, and Martha waved her off with a hand holding a coffee mug. Like gratitude was beside the point. Like kindness was just the baseline price of admission to this place and these people. The call came on the 11th day. Not a call, but a knock. Marlowe knew something was wrong the moment she heard the engine. 2 vehicles coming up the forest road at the same time. One a rental SUV, the other a white Lexus that caught the afternoon light and threw it back like a warning. Marlowe stepped onto the porch as they pulled into the clearing. Victoria climbed out of the Lexus first. Tailored slacks and a silk blouse entirely wrong for the Ozarks. Picking her way across the yard like the dirt might stain her. Behind her came Garrett, sports jacket, jaw tight. Eyes already scanning the property with the appraising look of someone calculating square footage and resale value. A sedan followed them, black, professional. A man in a suit emerged, briefcase. the careful bearing of someone who billed by the hour. And behind him, a woman with a camera, already photographing the cabin, framing shots that emphasize the remote location, the lack of visible power lines, the gravel road, everything that could be made to look like neglect instead of self-sufficiency. Victoria climbed the porch steps with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Marlowe. The cabin's charming, very rustic. I can see the appeal. Truly. Say what you came to say, Victoria. The smile dropped. Fine. You're not equipped to handle this. A fortune this size requires expertise you don't have and won't develop sleeping in cars and reading library books. We're filing for guardianship. The man in the suit stepped forward, briefcase open. Miss Beckett, I'm Gerald Thorne. The petition cites your history of housing instability, unemployment, and the potentially unsuitable conditions in which you're raising a minor child. You'll be served officially within 48 hours. I'd advise you to seek legal representation, though, given your financial history. I'm not sure who would take your case. Garrett's contribution was characteristically blunt. Just sign it over, Marlowe. You'll get a share. Family splits things fair. Wren moved out from behind Marlowe, stood at the porch railing, small and straight-backed, looking down at three adults who collectively made more in a year than Marlowe had made in a decade, who had come to take the only thing she'd ever been given. You're not family. Family doesn't leave people in parking lots. Victoria's expression curdled. Someone should teach this child some manners. Someone should teach you what the word family means. Wren's voice shook but did not break. You took Grandpa's money. You promised to pay it back. You didn't. And now you want to take the only thing anyone ever gave us. Uncle Silas knew you would. He said so. The silence that followed had a physical quality, dense and pressurized. Then Victoria turned on her heel and walked back to the Lexus. Get control of your daughter, Marlowe. We'll see you in court. They left in a spray of gravel. The photographer took 3 final shots from the road, framing the cabin against the sky in a way designed to make isolation look like danger. Marlowe realized she was gripping the porch railing hard enough to leave marks in her palms. She loosened her hands and turned to Wren, who stood trembling but upright, tears running down her face, chin still lifted. I shouldn't have said that. Wren's voice was small now, the bravery draining out of her as the adrenaline faded. I made it worse. Marlowe knelt down. You told the truth. The truth doesn't make things worse. It just makes the people who are lying uncomfortable. Hayes arrived the next morning with 2 people Marlowe hadn't expected. Patricia Dane, 50s, sharp-eyed, tailored in a way that managed to look professional without looking expensive, who specialized in high-value estate law and had handled cases involving collections worth more than Silas's. Robert Fielding, 40s, quiet and watchful, who defended against exactly the kind of guardianship petition Victoria was filing. Hayes had called them the night the news story broke, had known the way country lawyers know things that the family would come and that Marlowe would need more than a small-town attorney to protect her. They sat around Silas's table while Marlowe told them everything. The insurance money, the car, the 2 years, the letter, the vault, Victoria's petition. She told it straight. No self-pity, no embellishment. Just the facts arranged in the order they had happened. And watched Patricia take notes in a leather portfolio with an expression that said she'd heard this story before, in different forms, different families, the same greed dressed up in different clothes. First step is a trust. Patricia's pen didn't stop moving. Everything in the vault goes into it. You as sole trustee, even if they convince a judge you're impaired, which they won't, the trust structure makes the assets untouchable. They can still make her life hell trying. Robert spoke for the first time. Depositions, hearings, media pressure. They'll drag out every hard month she's had and put it under a spotlight. How long? 6 months to a year. Depends on how much money they're willing to burn. Marlowe looked at Wren, who sat in the corner with her notebook, drawing. Not a house this time, but something Marlowe couldn't see from this angle. Something that required intense concentration and a colored pencil Wren was pressing hard enough to leave grooves in the paper. A year of this, of Wren hearing strangers question whether her mother was fit to raise her, of a courtroom picking apart the worst 2 years of Marlowe's life and presenting them as evidence of permanent failure rather than temporary circumstance. What do I need to do everything we tell you? Patricia looked up from her notes. And nothing they provoke you into. The next 3 weeks moved fast. Medical evaluation by a psychologist in Eureka Springs who spent 2 hours with Marlowe and pronounced her cognitive function excellent. Her emotional regulation remarkable given her history. Her parenting capacity well above average. The doctor noted in her report that Marlowe had maintained her daughter's perfect school attendance through 24 months of homelessness, a fact that spoke to organizational ability and dedication most housed parents would struggle to match. Character references arrived in a stack that surprised Marlowe with its thickness. Sister Margaret wrote 4 pages. Martha wrote 2 in handwriting so decisive it looked like she was carving the words into the paper. Wren's new teacher in harmony wrote that Wren was reading 3 grades above level and showed emotional intelligence unusual for her age. Sheriff Tom Dillard, who'd introduced himself the previous week with a handshake and a quiet assurance that he kept an eye on Silas's property, because Silas had been a friend, submitted a report documenting the GPS tracker. His deputy had found magnetized to the underframe of Marlowe's Ford the day she'd driven into town to retrieve supplies. That's criminal surveillance, Dillard told Marlowe, standing in the yard with the small device in his gloved hand. Stalking, potentially. This goes in the court record. The community closed in around Marlowe and Wren in ways that felt less like charity and more like the natural response of people who'd known Silas and decided his family was their responsibility now. The mechanic in harmony serviced the Ford and wouldn't take payment. A woman Marlowe had never met left a box of winter clothes on the porch, sized exactly right for an 8-year-old. no note attached. Martha organized a rotation of neighbors who drove past the cabin once a day, not stopping, not intruding, just making sure the smoke was rising from the chimney and the truck was in the yard and nothing looked wrong. The veterans came on the third week, 6 men in their 70s and 80s, American Legion caps, VFW patches on worn jackets. They'd heard about Silas's family being challenged in court, heard that a man who'd served his country honorably and earned a Bronze Star was having his final wishes questioned by people who'd never given him the time of day when he was alive. They stood in Marlowe's yard with their hats in their hands and told her stories about Silas. How he'd shown up at the Legion Hall every Memorial Day. Never talked much but was always there. How he'd quietly paid the heating bill one winter when the hall couldn't afford it. How when Tom Dillard's father died, Silas had been one of 6 who carried the casket. Never asked. Just showed up. Did what needed doing. We take care of our own, the oldest one said, his voice carrying the weight of a generation that didn't explain itself much. Silas was one of ours. That makes you one of ours. We'll be at that courthouse, and we'll make sure the judge knows what kind of man Silas Beckett was. Patricia mentioned during one of their strategy sessions that they might need a contractor, if things went their way, to build housing for the foundation she was helping Marlowe structure. She had a name, James Crawford, a veteran carpenter from Eureka Springs who'd done good work on similar projects, understood the kind of quiet and precision Silas would have valued. Marlowe filed the name away. One more piece of the future she was trying to build from the wreckage of the past. The call came at 11 on a Tuesday night, 2 weeks before the court date. Marlowe was sitting at Silas's desk in the vault, cataloging the collection piece by piece the way Patricia had instructed, documenting everything for the trust. When her phone buzzed with Nora's number, Marlowe almost didn't answer, almost let it go to voicemail. But something in the lateness of the hour, the particular desperation of calling someone you've wronged at 11 at night, made her pick up. Nora's voice was raw, stripped of the careful neutrality she'd maintained at the cabin, down to something underneath that sounded like a person who'd been arguing with herself for days and had finally lost. I pulled my name off the petition this morning. Victoria doesn't know yet. Marlowe sat in the vault surrounded by Silas's life work and listened to her sister breathe on the other end of the line and waited for the rest of it. I keep thinking about Dad's funeral, how you paid for everything because none of us offered, how you stood at the grave holding Wren on your hip and I didn't even come over to help you carry her. She was heavy. I could see your arm shaking and I just stood there. Marlowe remembered, had trained herself not to remember, had filed that moment in the place where she kept things that hurt too much to examine regularly. But yes, she remembered. Her arm aching, Wren's weight, and the way her siblings had clustered together on the other side of the casket, like a separate family attending a different funeral. I'm not asking you to forgive me. Nora's voice cracked. I don't deserve it, and I know that. I just needed you to hear that at least one of us finally sees what we did." Silence stretched between them. 500 miles of phone line humming with everything that family was supposed to mean and hadn't. "Victoria is borrowing money to pay the lawyers." Nora spoke again. "Quieter now. She's in deep. Garrett, too. They think this is their last chance at something big. They're not gonna stop." Marlo closed her eyes. "Thank you for telling me." "Marlo, be careful. They have nothing to lose." The line went dead. Marlo sat alone in the vault with Silas's paintings watching from the walls. Those captured landscapes of mountains and rivers and skies that a quiet man had loved enough to keep in the dark for decades. And she felt the weight of what was coming settle onto her shoulders like a physical load. 2 weeks until the courthouse. 2 weeks until a judge would decide whether Victoria's performance or Marlo's reality carried more weight. 2 weeks until Wren would sit in a room full of strangers and listen to people argue about whether her mother was fit to raise her. Patricia called the next morning with something she had found during discovery preparation. A small fireproof safe in the back of Silas's workshop, behind a false panel in the wall, secured with a combination lock. They tried dates from Silas's military records without success, until Wren, sitting cross-legged on the workshop floor with the Bronze Star and Purple Heart certificates spread in front of her, read out the service number printed at the bottom of his discharge papers. The safe opened. Inside was a VHS tape in a plastic case, a sealed envelope, and a key to a safety deposit box at a bank in Eureka Springs. The envelope contained a single sheet of paper. Silas's handwriting, shakier than in the journal. Dated October of the previous year, 6 months before his death. "If you are watching this, you found everything and the wolves have arrived. I recorded this knowing exactly what would happen. Watch it. Show it in court if necessary." Hayes brought a VCR from his office. They connected it to a small television they found in the cabin's attic, plugged it into the solar battery system, and pressed play. Silas's face filled the screen. 87 years old, thin. His eyes sharp and clear beneath brows gone white with age. He sat at the desk in the vault, the same desk where Marlo had read his journal, paintings visible behind him on the shelves. And when he spoke, his voice was steady and certain, and carried the weight of a man who had planned this moment for years. "My name is Silas James Beckett. Today is October 15th, 2023. I am of sound mind and body, as will be attested by my physician and my attorney. I am recording this because I know what is coming." The night before the hearing, snow came to the Ozarks. Not the light, decorative flurries Marlo had seen in Tacoma, but real snow. Heavy and deliberate. The kind that buried roads and silenced the forest and turned the world into something clean and new. Marlo stood at the kitchen window and watched it fall, the flakes catching the lamplight and turning gold before they hit the ground and turned white again. Wren was asleep upstairs. Her notebook lay open on the kitchen table, turned to a page Marlo hadn't seen before. A drawing of the courthouse in Eureka Springs, done from memory after their drive past it last week. The stone columns, the steps, the flag. Two figures standing at the top of the steps, one tall, one small, both of them drawn with their backs straight and their hands at their sides and their faces turned forward, looking at whatever waited on the other side of those doors. Underneath in Wren's careful printing, "Tomorrow we don't run. Tomorrow we fight." Marlowe touched the page with one finger, tracing the outline of the smaller figure, and felt something settle deep in her chest. That was neither fear nor courage, but something harder and quieter than both. The certainty that tomorrow she would walk into a room full of people who wanted to take everything from her, and she would not let them. Because Silas had believed she was strong enough. Because Wren believed she was strong enough. Because somewhere in the last 2 years of losing everything, Marlowe had discovered that the thing her siblings could never take, the thing that survived the car and the parking lot and the hunger and the shame, was the simple fact that she was still standing. The snow kept falling. The stove crackled. The cabin held them safe while the mountain went white and quiet around them. And Marlowe sat at Silas's table with her daughter sleeping above her, and his legacy sleeping below her, and let herself believe just for this one night that tomorrow would be enough. The Jefferson County Courthouse stood at the end of a street lined with bare oaks, their branches black against a sky the color of pewter. Snow from the night before clung to the stone steps and the window ledges and the shoulders of the bronze soldier on the Civil War memorial out front. Marlowe walked up those steps at 8:30 with Wren's hand in hers, Patricia and Robert flanking them, and felt the cold bite through her coat and settle into her teeth. Inside, the hallway smelled of floor wax and old radiators, and the particular tension that accumulated in places where families came to destroy each other with paperwork and testimony. Victoria stood near the water fountain in a charcoal suit that probably cost more than Marlowe had earned in her last 3 months of nursing. Her posture perfect, her expression arranged into careful concern. Garrett paced by the windows, tie crooked, color already rising in his face. Nora was absent. Her empty space in their formation said everything her phone call had already said. Gerald Thorne conferred with 2 associates near the courtroom door, all of them carrying files thick enough to suggest they documented every hard month of Marlowe's life and intended to read each one aloud. Victoria noticed Marlowe and her expression shifted. A flicker of something sharp behind the performance, then settled back into the mask. They did not speak, did not approach each other, stood on opposite ends of the hallway and waited. Wren squeezed Marlowe's hand once, hard, and Marlowe squeezed back. The people from Harmony arrived in 1s and 2s, filling the gallery benches with a quiet deliberateness that felt like something being built. Martha Kincaid in her canvas jacket, reading glasses already on, folder of documents on her lap. Sheriff Dillard in full uniform, his badge catching the overhead lights. The mechanic who'd fixed the Ford. The woman who'd left the box of winter clothes on the porch. Wren's teacher from the Harmony School carrying a manila envelope. Sister Margaret, who'd driven since before dawn from Tacoma, sat straight-backed in the second row, her hands folded, her expression suggesting that God was watching and he was not impressed with what he saw. The veterans came last. 6 men in American Legion caps and VFW jackets, walking with the careful dignity of men whose knees had given out years ago, but whose backs refused to bend. They took seats in the 3rd row, removing their caps, placing them on their laps, and stared at the front of the courtroom with faces that had seen enough injustice in their lives to recognize it when it walked through the door. Judge Carolyn Winters entered at 9, silver-haired, mid-60s, with a face that had presided over enough family disputes to have developed a permanent skepticism toward people who cried on cue. She arranged her papers, surveyed the room, and called the case. Thorne went first. His presentation was smooth, professionally concerned, structured to build the image of a fragile woman stumbling into wealth she couldn't comprehend. He walked the judge through Marlowe's employment gaps, her eviction records, the months in the Ford. He presented the cabin's lack of grid power and municipal water as evidence of unsuitable conditions for a child. He framed the isolation as neglect, the self-sufficiency as desperation, the inheritance itself as a burden too heavy for someone with Marlowe's history of instability. Victoria took the stand and performed brilliantly. Years of real estate sales had taught her to read a room and deliver exactly what the audience needed to hear. She delivered concern in measured doses, pausing at strategic moments, letting her voice catch when she described how worried she'd been, how many sleepless nights she'd spent thinking about little Wren in that remote cabin with no neighbors and no safety net. We only want what's best for them. Victoria's voice wavered just enough. Marlowe has always struggled. We've tried to help, but she pushes us away. And now with this inheritance, we're terrified she's going to make decisions that will hurt Wren. We love them both. We're only doing this because we have to. The rewriting was breathtaking. In Victoria's telling, the stolen insurance money became a misunderstanding, a loan that Marlowe had simply forgotten about. The blocked phone numbers became boundaries Victoria had set for her own mental health. After Marlowe became too demanding, the 2 years of silence became space Victoria had given her sister to find her footing. Garrett followed with his version. The long-suffering brother who'd watched Marlowe make poor choice after poor choice, who'd tried to intervene, who'd been pushed away by her stubbornness. He spoke about the parking lot with what sounded like genuine anguish, how it killed him to know his sister and niece were living like that. How many times he'd offered help only to have Marlowe hang up on him. I love my sister. Garrett's voice went rough. But love isn't enough when someone won't help themselves. Robert Fielding stood when they finished. His first question was directed at the judge rather than the witnesses. Your Honor, I'd like to enter into evidence bank records showing wire transfers totaling $87,000 from Marlowe Beckett's accounts to those of her siblings between March and August of 2022, none of which were repaid. He paused. I'd also like to enter phone records showing 46 unanswered calls from Miss Beckett to her siblings during the period she was living in her vehicle, and a police report documenting an illegal GPS tracking device recovered from Miss Beckett's car, placed there subsequent to the filing of this petition. The documents landed on the courtroom like stones dropped into still water. Victoria's expression didn't change, but her hands in her lap went white at the knuckles. Garrett's color deepened from pink to a red that spread up his neck and across his forehead. Robert called witnesses the way a carpenter placed nails, each one exactly where it needed to be. Sister Margaret spoke about Marlowe at 19, fleeing domestic violence, working doubles, finishing nursing school with an infant on her hip. She spoke about Marlowe at 34, returning to the shelter not for a bed, but for a mailing address, maintaining her daughter's enrollment and attendance and dignity through circumstances that would have excused any lapse. I have worked with hundreds of mothers over 40 years. Her voice carried the weight of a woman who did not say things she did not mean. Marlowe Beckett is among the most competent and devoted I have ever known. To use her vulnerability as proof of failure is not just incorrect, it is cruel. Martha told the judge about Silas. 30 years of knowing him, his quiet visits to her store, his careful comments about the world, his assessment of his own family that had proven precise to the letter. She read from a note Silas had left with Hayes years earlier, never shared until now. When the time comes, the town will know what to do. Silas built for the long term. That included building the community that would protect what he left behind. Sheriff Dillard presented the GPS tracker in an evidence bag and testified that its placement constituted criminal surveillance under Arkansas state law, that it had been affixed to the vehicle after the inheritance became public knowledge, that it demonstrated not concern for a family member's welfare, but monitoring of an adversary's movements. The oldest veteran stood to testify. His name was Frank Morrison, and he'd served in Korea. He walked to the stand slowly, his cane tapping against the floor. When he sat, his voice was clear and carried to every corner of the courtroom. Silas Beckett earned a Bronze Star, not for being in the right place, but for saving 3 men under fire. He never talked about it. That's how you knew it was real. The ones who did something don't talk. The ones who talk didn't do anything. He looked directly at Victoria and Garrett. Silas came to every Memorial Day service for 40 years. Never missed one. Never asked for anything. Just showed up. That's the kind of man he was. And when a man like that makes a decision about his life's work, you honor it. You don't question it. You don't try to take it away because you think you know better. He turned back to the judge. We're here because Silas was one of ours. Military doesn't end when you take off the uniform. It's for life. And we take care of our own. That means we take care of the people they chose to protect. Marlowe and her daughter are under that protection now. And we're asking this court to honor what Silas wanted, because he earned that right. Judge Winters asked to hear from Marlowe. Marlowe walked to the stand with her pulse visible in her throat and her hands steady at her sides. Sat down, looked at the judge, did not look at Victoria. The questions probed deep. Why had she been homeless? What happened with the money? How was she managing the estate? What were her plans? Marlowe answered each one the way she'd answered every hard question in her life. Directly and without decoration. Yes, I lived in my car. Yes, I was evicted after my siblings took money they promised to return. Yes, the past 2 years were the hardest of my life. But I kept Wren enrolled, kept her fed, kept her clothed and safe and reading above grade level, kept her believing that things could get better, even when I wasn't sure they could. She paused. I'm not managing this estate alone. I have attorneys who specialize in exactly this. I have a trust structure in place. I have a plan for preservation and a plan for giving. Silas didn't leave me this because he thought I was perfect. He left it because he thought I was honest. And I am. Judge Winters turned to Wren. The courtroom shifted, everyone leaning forward slightly, drawn by the gravity of a child about to speak in a room full of adults who'd been arguing about her as if she weren't there. Wren walked to the stand. She was wearing the corduroy dress Martha had brought over the previous week, the one that fit properly and had buttons that all matched. Her hair was pulled back in a braid Marlowe had done that morning with hands that shook only slightly. She sat in the witness chair and her feet didn't reach the floor. She folded her hands on the rail in front of her and looked at the judge with those dark, serious eyes. Do you understand why we're here today, Wren? Yes, ma'am. My aunt and uncle want to take our home and say my mom can't take care of me. Can you tell me about living with your mother? Wren's voice was clear, practiced in the way that children's voices became practiced when they'd been forced to explain things adults should have understood without being told. When we lived in the car, my mom always made sure I ate first. She'd split a granola bar and give me the bigger half and think I didn't notice, but I always noticed. She walked me to school every single day, even when it was raining and she didn't have an umbrella. She helped me with homework at the library, made sure I had clean clothes even if she had to wash them in a gas station bathroom. She never once made me feel like it was my fault. Wren's hands tightened on the rail, and now, at the cabin now, I have my own room. I can hear birds in the morning. My mom taught me how to build a fire and pump water. I have friends at school. I'm getting good grades. I feel safe. Your aunt and uncle say they're worried about you. Wren's jaw set. The same angle Marlowe had seen in the parking lot of Sister Margaret's shelter. The same refusal to yield that William Beckett had carried, and Silas had recognized from a distance. They weren't worried when we were sleeping in a parking lot. They weren't worried when Mom called them for help and they blocked her number. They're worried now because there's money and they want. She reached into the pocket of her dress and pulled out a folded piece of paper, soft at the creases from weeks of handling. Uncle Silas wrote me a letter. He wrote it before he died. He said to be brave and protect my mom because she spent her whole life protecting me. He knew they would come. He told me not to let them take what he built for us. She handed the letter to the bailiff, who passed it to the judge. The courtroom held its breath while Judge Winters read, her face moving through expressions that settled finally into something tight around the eyes that might have been anger. directed not at the child but at the adults who'd made a child's testimony necessary. Patricia stood. "Your Honor, we have one final piece of evidence. Silas James Beckett recorded this in October of last year, 6 months before his death, with instructions that it be shown only if his chosen heirs face legal challenge from family members." The television was wheeled in. Hayes had brought the VCR. They'd tested it that morning, made sure it worked. Patricia inserted the tape, pressed play. Static. Then Silas's face filled the screen, 87 years old and sharp as a blade, sitting in the vault surrounded by the collection he'd built across 3.5 decades of patience. His hands were folded on the desk. His eyes looked directly into the camera. And when he spoke, his voice had the quality of someone who'd thought very carefully about every word. "My name is Silas James Beckett. Today is October 15th, 2023. I am of sound mind and body, as will be attested by my physician and my attorney. I am recording this because I know what is coming." He paused, not for effect, but because what he was about to say needed space around it. "I have watched this family for 40 years. I have watched Marlo give, and I have watched her siblings take. I have watched them steal from her and abandon her and blame her for the poverty they caused. When they learn what I have left her, they will come for it. They will claim concern. They will claim incompetence. They will lie with the ease of people who have never been held accountable for a lie in their lives." His voice didn't rise, didn't need to. The calm certainty was more devastating than any anger could have been. "But they are owed nothing. This collection is mine. I built it with my own hands and my own patience over 35 years. I gave it to Marlo Beckett and her daughter Wren. No one else. I chose them, deliberately, after decades of observation, after watching how they treated people when there was nothing to gain from kindness, after seeing them give without counting and love without conditions." He looked directly into the camera, the way he'd looked at Marlo at William's funeral, standing in the back of the church, seeing everything, being seen by no one. To any court reviewing this recording, I was a veteran, an accountant, a collector. I maintained my faculties until the end. I paid my taxes. I kept my records. I made my choices with full awareness of their implications. These are my wishes, documented, witnessed, absolute. His expression softened slightly, just enough to show the man behind the words. "To Marlo and Wren, stand firm. You deserve this. Don't let them take what I built for you. Blood does not make family. Character does. And the two of you have more character in your smallest moments than your siblings have shown in their entire lives." The screen went to static, then black. The silence in the courtroom had weight, substance. You could have built something with it. Judge Winters sat back, looked at Victoria, whose face had gone the color of paper, at Garrett, who stared at his hands, at the empty seat where Nora would have been. When she spoke, her voice carried the full weight of the bench. "I have heard from professionals, from community members, from the parent and child at the center of this petition, and from the deceased himself, who demonstrated a degree of foresight I have rarely encountered in this courtroom. She pulled her reading glasses down and looked directly at Victoria and Garrett. The petitioner's claims of concern are contradicted by every piece of evidence before me. You did not call when your sister was homeless. You did not visit. You did not respond to her requests for help. You took her money. You abandoned her. And you returned only when there was more to take. The gavel came down. Petition denied. Petitioners will pay all legal costs incurred by the respondent. Any further contact constituting harassment will result in criminal referral and restraining orders. This court finds Marlo Beckett to be a competent, capable, and devoted parent who has demonstrated judgment and resilience under circumstances that most people will never face and could not endure. Another strike of the gavel. Case dismissed. Martha started clapping. Then the mechanic. Sister Margaret brought her hands together once, firmly, like closing a book. The veterans stood and saluted. Not the flag, not the judge, but the empty air where Silas's voice had been moments before. Marlo pulled Wren into her arms and felt her daughter shaking. All the bravery leaving her body at once now that she didn't need it anymore. Held her there in the courtroom while the people who'd come to take everything gathered their papers and their coats and walked out past the people who'd come to make sure they couldn't. 3 years later, the cabin looked the same from the road, which was how Marlo wanted it. Log walls gone dark with weather, green metal roof, stone chimney, porch with Silas's carved railings. If you didn't know what lay beneath it, you'd see nothing but a well-maintained home in the Ozark woods, quiet and unremarkable and exactly right. But the clearing had grown. 3 small timber frame houses stood along the tree line south of the cabin, each one built by James Crawford, the veteran carpenter Patricia had mentioned. He'd come to assess the site 2 weeks after the trial, stayed to build the foundation, and somewhere in the months of working side by side with Marlo, measuring and planning and creating something that mattered, they'd built something else too. Not rushed, not dramatic, just 2 people who understood quiet and patience and the particular courage required to build a life after the previous one burned down. The timber building adjacent to the cabin held offices and a meeting room and a kitchen where meals were prepared for women who'd forgotten what it felt like to sit down to food they didn't have to worry about. The Silas Beckett Foundation operated from that building. Legal aid for single mothers, job training programs, emergency housing in the tiny homes, each one with a wood stove and a locking door and windows that looked out at mountains. A hotline staffed by women who'd been through it and come out the other side. 214 mothers helped in 3 years, not thousands. A real number. Earned one family at a time. Marlo sat on the porch on a Saturday morning in October, coffee in her hands, watching the foundation's weekend volunteer crew set up for the fall intake session. 3 new mothers arriving today, each of them carrying whatever they had managed to hold on to, each of them looking the way Marlo had looked, walking up Sister Margaret's steps 3 years ago. Braced for judgment, hoping for grace. Wren was 11 now, taller, her auburn hair longer, her confidence worn naturally rather than summoned through force of will. She helped with the youth programs on weekends, reading to the younger children, showing them the trails Silas had cut through the forest, teaching them to identify birds the way Martha had taught her. She came out onto the porch carrying her notebook, the same notebook, though the cover was held together with tape now, and the spiral had lost most of its rings. She sat down next to Marlowe and opened it to a page near the back. The drawing was different from all the ones that came before. Not a single house, but the whole clearing rendered from above, as if Wren had climbed the ridge and looked down. The cabin in the center, the tiny homes along the tree line, the foundation building with its open door, people on the paths between them. None of them stick figures anymore, but small careful shapes, each one distinct. Mountains behind, sky above, colored in a blue so deep, Wren had pressed the pencil until the wax was nearly gone. At the bottom, in handwriting that had matured from the careful block printing of a child into something more fluid but still recognizable, she'd written what we built together. Marlowe studied the drawing and felt her throat tighten. Every house Wren had ever drawn, every imagined chimney and garden and swing set, every three-figured family standing in front of a door, had been leading to this. Not a fantasy, but a record. Not what she wished for, but what existed. The real thing built from a dead man's foresight and a mother's refusal to give up, and a daughter's belief that home was not a place you were given, but a thing you made with your hands out of whatever material survived the wreck. "Mom, are you happy?" Marlowe considered the question, turned it over the way she'd turn a stone from the creek, looking for what was underneath. She still checked the locks twice at night, still woke sometimes gasping from dreams where the ford was the only roof they had, still carried the hypervigilance of a woman who'd learned that safety could be revoked without warning by people who were supposed to provide it. But Wren was healthy and brave, and becoming someone remarkable. The foundation was real and growing and doing exactly what Silas had trusted Marlowe to do with his gift. James was inside making breakfast, his footsteps solid and familiar on the floorboards, a presence that asked nothing and gave everything and understood that healing was not a destination, but a direction you walked in day after day, until the distance between who you were and who you wanted to be became small enough to live with. "Yes, sweetheart, I really am." Wren leaned against her shoulder. The notebook lay open between them, the drawing of the clearing facing the actual clearing, fiction and reality overlapping until you couldn't tell which one had come first. "Do you think Uncle Silas knew we'd do all this?" Marlowe took a sip of her coffee and watched the morning light move across the mountains, the ridge lines turning gold the way they did every October, when the oaks changed and the air went thin and sweet and smelled like wood smoke and fallen leaves, and the particular clean distance of places where the nearest neighbor was a mile away and the nearest city was an hour, and the nearest version of the life you used to live was so far behind you. It had become a story you told rather than a wound you carried. I think he hoped, and I think sometimes hope is enough. The owl that lived in the oak at the edge of the clearing called once, long and low. Something moved in the underbrush. The mountain stood where it had stood for 100 million years, patient and permanent and indifferent to the small dramas of the people who lived in its shadow. But the people were not indifferent to each other. That was the point. That had always been the point, not the money in the vault, or the paintings on the shelves, or the trust documents filed in triplicate at the courthouse. The point was the door that stayed open, the meals shared without tallying the cost, the stranger who left clothes on a porch without a note, the community that closed ranks around two people it had no obligation to protect and protected them anyway. Because that was what you did. Because Silas had built that too. Had spent 35 years being the kind of neighbor who showed up with a ladder after an ice storm. And the town had learned from him the way Wren had learned from Marlowe. The way Marlowe had learned from William. That giving without keeping score was not weakness but the rarest and most durable kind of strength. Wren closed her notebook. The last page. The drawing of the clearing pressed against all the pages that came before it. All those houses she had drawn in the back seat of a car in a parking lot in Tacoma. All those chimneys with imaginary smoke and gardens with imaginary flowers and 3 stick figures holding hands in front of doors that didn't exist. They existed now. Every single one of those drawings had been a blueprint for this morning, this porch, this life. She just hadn't known it yet. The first car pulled into the clearing. A woman in her 30s with 2 children in the back seat, all of them looking at the cabin the way Marlowe and Wren had looked at it 3 years ago, like it might disappear if they looked away. Like hope was something you had to hold carefully because you'd watched it break too many times before. Marlowe stood up and went to meet them. She did this every time. Walked down the porch steps and across the clearing and said the only thing that mattered. You're safe here. You and your children. For as long as you need. And someday, years from now, someone would ask Wren about her uncle Silas. The man who lived alone in the woods and left his life's work to a woman the world had overlooked. And Wren would say he taught us that a house isn't walls and a roof. It's a door that stays open, and the drawing she'd make that day would show exactly that. A door wide open, light pouring through it. And on the other side, everyone who had ever needed a place to stand.